Who will take care of the cog in the huge mechanism when it wears out and ceases to be useful? We are used to seeing lavish balls and impeccable dinners in films about the Victorian era, where servants are invisible shadows serving tea. But no one tells us what happened to these people when their hands began to tremble with age, and their legs refused to run up endless staircases. Behind the front doors of mansions lay a cruel system of human resource disposal, devoid of pity and sentiment. Yesterday's butler, who kept the secrets of the lords, could find himself in an icy ditch today, forgotten by everyone to whom he had devoted his life. This side of history is steeped in the cold indifference and fear that haunted every person in livery from their first day of service. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why loyalty to one's masters in those days was the most unreliable retirement plan, and where those who devoted their entire lives to serving the comfort of others actually disappeared too. Have you ever wondered why servants always look so serious and tense in old photographs? To begin with, I will reveal the truth that destroys the myth of the good old days and patriarchal care. In Victorian England, there was a carefully crafted illusion that servants were part of a large family that the master would care for until his death. Young maids and footmen believed in this unspoken contract, giving up their health and time in exchange for a roof over their heads and a sense of security. They lived in wealthy homes, ate leftovers from the master's table, and wore quality clothes that were given to them for work. This created a false sense of stability that lulled them into complacency and prevented them from thinking about the future. But this family bond was one-sided and lasted only as long as the servant could perform their duties flawlessly. As soon as their efficiency declined, the mask of kindness instantly fell away, revealing the employer's cold calculation. Dismissals often happened suddenly, without lengthy discussions or severance pay, turning yesterday's family member into a stranger. The owners did not want to see frail old people in their corridors, reminding them of the transience of life and spoiling the aesthetics of their luxurious home. The servant's old age was perceived not as a reason to be grateful for their long years of service, but as an unfortunate breakdown of a useful tool. Housekeepers and butlers, who had authority over junior staff, themselves became victims of the system as soon as their grip weakened. The cruelty of the situation lay in the fact that the servant lost not just his job, but his entire world, home, and social status at the same time. Many of them had become so attached to the house and the habits of their masters that they could not imagine life outside the estate. They had no home of their own, did not know how to run their own household, and often had no family, as service required complete renunciation of personal life. Finding themselves on the street with a suitcase of personal belongings, they experienced a deep psychological shock comparable to the loss of identity. Their entire lives were built around the schedules of strangers, and without this anchor, they found themselves disoriented. The world outside the mansion walls was hostile, expensive, and completely incomprehensible to those accustomed to the closed ecosystem of the estate. The situation was especially tragic for those who had served in the same house for decades and sincerely loved their employers. They expected that human relationships would outweigh economic expediency, but in the era of industrialization, feelings were cheap. The aristocracy, whose incomes were often reduced, was the first to start saving on staff costs, getting rid of extra mouths to feed. An old servant required care, attention, and possibly medical treatment, which did not fit into the budget of a thrifty household. Therefore, the decision to dismiss them was presented as a necessary measure, often accompanied by hypocritical wishes for good luck. Thrown overboard, these people faced complete social isolation, as their social circle was limited to other servants. Friends and acquaintances who remained in the house could not help them, fearing to anger their employers and lose their jobs. The recommendation system on which the career of any servant depended worked against them in this case. A letter of recommendation could politely refer to age-related infirmity, which effectively became a wolf ticket. Without a good recommendation, it was impossible to find a new job, and with a bad one, they were not even hired for the dirtiest jobs. Thus, the devotion and loyalty that were cultivated as the main virtues of a servant ultimately played a cruel joke on them. They sacrificed the opportunity to start a family and accumulate capital in order to serve the interests of others. When the hour of reckoning came, it turned out that their sacrifice was in vain and unnecessary. It was a betrayal that broke people no less than hunger and cold. I am very interested to hear your opinion on such corporate ethics of the past. What do you think about people who threw their loyal assistants out onto the street? Write about it in the comments. And to make sure you don't miss stories about other forgotten professions, be sure to subscribe to the channel. You may ask, couldn't they save money for their old age while working in such wealthy households? Let's take a look at the financial reality of the time, which was far from our ideas about salaries. Servants' wages in the Victorian era were extremely low, as it was believed that their basic needs were covered by their employer. Food, housing, uniforms, candles, and even laundry were all provided by the employer, creating the illusion of complete security. The cash that servants received was considered more like pocket money than a full income. Servants spent most of this modest salary on maintaining their appearance, which was necessary to match the status of the household. Good gloves, high-quality stockings, and additional wardrobe items were often purchased at their own expense. In addition, there was a tradition of sending money to poor relatives in the countryside who relied on the help of a well-established family member. As a result, by the end of the year, most servants had virtually no savings left. The banking system was inaccessible to ordinary people, and the culture of investment was completely absent in this environment. The lack of a state pension system made the situation catastrophic for any aging working-class person. The Old Age Pensions Act did not appear in England until the very beginning of the 20th century, and it was extremely limited. In the Victorian era, caring for the elderly fell entirely on the shoulders of their families or charitable organizations. But servants who had lived their lives in someone else's home often had neither family nor connections to the outside world. They found themselves in a financial vacuum, with no savings, no insurance, and no state support. Employers sometimes paid small sums upon dismissal, but this money quickly melted away when paying rent and buying food. Coal and food prices in cities were high, and an elderly person could not save on heating as effectively as a young person. Every day of independent life ate away at the crumbs they had managed to save over years of service. Fear of poverty forced them to economize on everything, which quickly led to a deterioration in their health and appearance. Were there exceptions to this rule when servants managed to accumulate wealth? Extremely rarely, and usually this concerned the highest echelon of servants, butlers or housekeepers in very wealthy homes. They could receive tips from guests, interest from deals with suppliers, and had higher salaries. But even for them, any serious illness or bad investment could mean complete ruin. For the vast majority, maids, cooks, footmen, it was mathematically impossible to save enough for a comfortable retirement. Attempts to find part-time work after dismissal often ended in failure due to a lack of skills applicable outside the big house. A former footman who knew how to polish silver perfectly and serve wine was useless in a factory or port. Their specific skills could not be converted into earnings in the real world, where brute physical strength or craftsmanship was required. They became hostages to their profession, which did not provide them with universal tools for survival. Social propaganda at the time insisted on the need for thriftiness, accusing the poor of wastefulness. But how can you be thrifty when your annual income is barely enough to cover the bare necessities?
That's my final offer.
This rhetoric only reinforced the guilt of those at the bottom, making them ashamed of their poverty. Society refused to acknowledge the systemic problem, preferring to blame everything on the personal shortcomings of the poor. Financial literacy was not taught to servants. They were taught only obedience and how to manage their masters' households. They did not know how money worked or how to avoid scammers who often preyed on the savings of the elderly. Many lost their modest savings by trusting dishonest businessmen or investing in dubious ventures. This was the final blow, after which any hope of a dignified old age disappeared completely. The system was designed to keep servants dependent on their masters until the very end. Savings would give them freedom of choice, and freedom of choice for servants was undesirable for employers. Therefore, low wages were not just a cost-saving measure, but a tool for controlling and retaining staff. Do you think it is fair to pay an employee less and provide them with housing, or is it better to pay them a full salary? In the next chapter, you will learn about the humiliating tricks servants use to hide their age. Here is the secret that forced servants to commit crimes against their own health in order to keep their jobs. In a world where old age was a death sentence, appearance became the main commodity that had to be preserved at all costs. A gray hair or a wrinkle could lead to dismissal, so servants resorted to incredible tricks to prolong their professional youth. It was a real secret industry, hidden from the eyes of their masters in cramped servants' quarters. Hair dyeing was the most common but also the most dangerous procedure in the arsenal of an aging servant. Professional dyes were expensive, so toxic homemade mixtures based on lead, sulfur, and even gutta percha were used. These substances not only damaged the hair, but also slowly poisoned the body, being absorbed through the scalp. But the fear of losing one's job was stronger than the fear of poisoning, and people continued to mask their gray hair, risking their health. The jet black hair of a 60-year-old butler looked unnatural, but it was better than noble gray hair, leading to dismissal. Female servants, especially maids and nannies, whose duties required mobility and a pleasant appearance, suffered even more from this pressure. They used tight corsets not only for shape, but also to hide age-related changes in their figures and support their backs. Back pain was masked by the use of laudanum, a popular opium tincture at the time, which helped them get through the day on their feet. This led to addiction, which only accelerated the physical destruction of the body, closing the circle of problems. There was a whole underground market for secondhand goods, where servants bought dentures, often extracted from the deceased. Tooth loss was a clear sign of old age and poor health, which was unacceptable for those who served at the table. Waterloo teeth, as they were popularly known, were a hot commodity that allowed one to maintain the appearance of a healthy smile. This sounds gruesome to modern sensibilities, but at the time it was a matter of survival and maintaining status. Glasses were also unofficially banned for servants who were in full view of their masters and guests. It was believed that a servant wearing glasses looked ridiculous and worse, had poor eyesight, which meant they might not notice dust or stains. Therefore, many worked practically blind, relying on touch and memory, just so they wouldn't have to wear glasses. This led to mistakes, broken dishes, and as a result, the very dismissals they were trying to avoid. Every morning began with a thorough examination of themselves in the mirror in search of new telltale signs of aging. Each new wrinkle caused panic and a desire to cover it up with powder or tighten the skin. This constant tension and fear of being exposed created an unbearable psychological burden. A person could not be themselves even when alone, constantly playing the role of a younger version of themselves. The irony was that the owners often noticed these tricks, but kept quiet until the time was right. The sight of an aging butler with dyed hair roused their disgust or ridicule, but as long as he coped, they tolerated him. However, as soon as the mask stopped working and frailty became apparent, Dismissal followed immediately. All the effort spent on disguise proved futile in the face of the inexorable passage of time. In this race for youth, servants spent their last money on charlatans selling elixirs of youth and miracle ointments. Newspapers of the time were full of advertisements promising to restore strength and beauty, and desperate people became easy prey. They bought hope, which was packaged in bottles of tinted water or dangerous chemicals. This battle against nature was doomed to failure from the outset, but it shows the extent of people's desperation. They were willing to poison themselves, endure pain and humiliation, just to delay the inevitable end of their careers. If this information about the hidden lives of servants surprised you, don't forget to like this video. It helps us find even more rare facts. Guess which building was feared more than prison? For any poor person in Victorian England, and especially for a former servant, the words workhouse sounded like a funeral bell. It was a place where those who had no money, no home, and no hope ended up, the final stop on the way down. The workhouse system was deliberately designed to be as repulsive as possible and to deter people from seeking help until the very last moment. It was not charity, but a punitive machine for those who dared to become poor and infirm. The workhouse buildings resembled prisons with high walls, narrow windows, and endless corridors. Inside, there was a regime of strict discipline, complete silence, and constant supervision. Upon admission, a person's personal belongings, even the most sentimental trinkets, were taken away and replaced with a rough, humiliating uniform. It was an act of complete erasure of personality. You were no longer Butler Jones. You were just an accounting unit, a recipient of government porridge. One of the cruelest features of this system was the forced separation of families. Husbands, wives, and children were kept in different wings of the building and could only see each other during short visits on Sundays. For elderly couples who had lived together all their lives, this separation was a fatal blow, depriving them of their last emotional support. They died alone, knowing that their loved one was behind the wall, but unable to hold their hand. The work in the workhouse was meaningless and exhausting, designed not to be useful, but to break the will. The elderly were forced to break stones for paving roads or pick apart old tarred ropes for tow. This work tore their fingers to shreds, caused terrible pain in their joints, and gave them no satisfaction. For former servants accustomed to cleanliness and order, the mess of dirt and dust was an additional humiliation. The food was meager and monotonous, designed only to sustain physical existence, not health. Thin porridge, a piece of stale bread, a little cheese. That was the entire ration, which was supposed to discourage anyone from lingering here. A constant feeling of hunger became a companion to the inhabitants, forcing them to hide crumbs and steal food from each other. This turned people into animals, destroying what remained of their human dignity. Sanitary conditions, despite outward strictness, were often appalling due to overcrowding. It was constantly cold as heating was economized, and the elderly suffered from rheumatism and lung diseases. In such conditions, any cold quickly developed into pneumonia, which was a frequent cause of death. Mortality in workhouses was high, and this was perceived by the administration as a natural process of contingent attrition. The attitude of the staff towards the residents was indifferent at best, and often openly cruel. The guards, often recruited from among the same poor people, took out their anger on the defenseless elderly. There was no one to complain to as the outside world tried not to notice what was happening behind the high walls. Society believed that if a person ended up here, it was their own fault. Being sent to a workhouse was a mark of shame that could not be washed away. People preferred to starve on the streets and live in damp basements rather than go to this Bastille for the poor. The very fact of dying in a workhouse and being buried in a common grave without a headstone frightened Victorians more than death itself. For a former servant who once poured wine into crystal glasses, Ending up with a bowl of gruel in his hands was the collapse of the entire universe. It was a vivid lesson in what their lives were really worth in the eyes of the system. Do you think society treated its elderly fairly? Or was it a necessary measure for the economy of the time? In the next chapter, you will learn why even having relatives did not save former servants from this fate. It would seem that the most logical solution for an old servant would be to return to his native village, to the family he once left behind. But reality was much harsher and more pragmatic than sentimental novels. Over the years or even decades of absence, ties with relatives had weakened and often been severed completely. The servant became a cut-off piece for his family, a stranger who lived in another world and spoke another language. The return of an old, sick, and most importantly, penniless relative was a real disaster for a peasant family. In cramped cottages, where several people slept in one room, there was simply no physical space for another tenant. An extra mouth that could not work in the fields or on the farm became an unbearable burden on the budget of a family that was barely making ends meet. It often happened that the parents whom the servant remembered had already died, and his brothers and sisters had large families of their own. His nephews and grandchildren did not know this uncle from London at all and felt no kinship towards him. To them, he was just a stranger claiming their meager piece of bread in a corner by the hearth. Conflicts over everyday matters flared up instantly, making life together unbearable. The servants themselves understood their inappropriateness and were often ashamed to return in such a position. Pride prevented them from appearing before their fellow villagers as freeloaders begging for alms. They preferred to remain in the city, dissolving into the faceless crowd of poor people, rather than endure humiliation and reproaches from their own relatives. Sometimes it was impossible to return because the village itself had been lost due to industrialization or land enclosure. The places they remembered from childhood had changed beyond recognition or disappeared from the face of the earth. Houses were demolished, communities fell apart, and there was simply nowhere to return to. The lack of a communication system also played a role. Letters took a long time to arrive, and many people were illiterate. A servant could arrive in his native place and find that there was not a single living soul left who remembered him. It was a terrible discovery to realize that you had no roots and no place to call home. Thus, severing ties with their families was the price servants paid for their careers. They became people without kin or tribe, belonging only to their master's house. And when the house rejected them, they were left hanging in limbo. Loneliness became their only companion in their final years. They were too aristocratic for the village and too poor for the city. This social homelessness was perhaps the hardest trial of all. The story of these people is a reminder of how easy it is to lose touch with one's roots in the pursuit of illusory prosperity. But if not family and not a working home, what was left? In the next chapter, you will learn how the former elites of the servant world survived on the cold streets of the city. Ready to learn the truth about what former butlers did on the streets? When the doors of the workhouse were intimidating and relatives turned away, the street became the only place to live. London's sidewalks were filled with people trying to earn a penny for a piece of bread. For former servants, this was a fall to the very bottom.
Read all about it. Special evening edition. Get your paper here.
One of the most common occupations was small-scale street trading. Old women, once maids, sold shoelaces, pins, or matches, standing in the wind in their worn dresses. This was a veiled form of begging, as the goods were often just a pretext for approaching passers-by. They tried to preserve what remained of their dignity by offering useful things, rather than simply holding out their hands. Men often tried to earn money by offering their services as shoe shiners or porters, but competition was fierce. Young street boys were faster, bolder, and stronger, pushing the elderly away from wealthy customers. A former footman suffering from shortness of breath found it difficult to run after a carriage to open the door for a gentleman in the hope of receiving a small coin. Often they simply sat on street corners, silently displaying their poverty. Some tried to use their professional skills in a simplified form. Former cooks baked cheap pies or cooked hot broth, selling it to workers early in the morning. But this required at least some startup capital for food and coal, which most did not have. In addition, the police chased street vendors, fined them, and confiscated their goods, making this business extremely risky. Clothes that were once a source of pride quickly fell into disrepair and turned into rags. Liveries and uniform dresses were sold to junk dealers for pennies, and in return, something was bought that could at least keep them warm. The sight of a person in the remains of good clothing, but with holey shoes, was typical of the London slums of the time. Such people spent the night in fourpence night shelters, where they slept huddled together in stuffy rooms, or in coffins, wooden boxes for sleeping. Those who did not even have this money spent their nights on benches, under bridges, or in doorways, risking freezing to death. The street slowly killed them, robbing them of their health and what remained of their human dignity. The worst thing was that they often met their former masters or their acquaintances on the street. At such moments, they tried to turn away, to hide their faces so as not to be recognized. Shame was stronger than hunger, and the masters, even when they recognized a former servant, often quickened their pace, preferring not to notice the unpleasant reminder of someone else's misfortune. Alcohol became a frequent companion to this decline. Cheap gin helped them forget the cold, hunger, and humiliation for a while. It dulled the pain in their joints and gave them the illusion of warmth, but in return took away their last strength and sanity. Drunken former servants were a common sight at the doors of pubs in poor neighborhoods. It was a slow agony stretching out over months or years. People who were used to cleanliness and order died in the filth of the sewers, becoming nameless statistics in police reports. Their stories dissolved into the noise of the big city, uninteresting and unnecessary to anyone. This was the end of the road for those who could not stay afloat. But was there any alternative to this hopelessness? In the next chapter, we will talk about charitable societies and why their help was available only to a few. In Victorian England, there were many charitable societies created specifically to help the poor. It would seem that this was salvation for old servants. However, the reality was that it was incredibly difficult to get help from these organizations. It was a system built not on charity for all, but on a strict selection of the worthy poor. To receive a pension or a place in a shelter, one had to go through humiliating checks and meet unthinkable moral standards. Servants' aid societies existed, but their resources were extremely limited. They lived on donations from wealthy patrons who wanted to be sure that their money was going to the right people. Therefore, candidates for assistance had to provide impeccable references from all previous employers. A single gap in one's employment history or a hint of drunkenness closed the doors of charity forever. Applicants had to prove their complete poverty while maintaining respectability. Inspectors from the societies would visit their humble dwellings, check every corner, and ask intimate questions about their personal lives and spending. It was total control, where assistance was exchanged for complete submission to the rules of society. The slightest violation of the regime or display of ingratitude could lead to the loss of benefits. The queues for pensions stretched on for years. People submitted petitions, collected signatures, and voted at society meetings, hoping that they would be chosen that year. Often, people died without ever getting their turn, while the bureaucratic machine ground through their paperwork. It was a lottery where the stakes were life itself, and only a few won. There was a division along religious lines. Anglican societies helped only Anglicans, Catholic societies helped only Catholics, and so on. If a servant was not a diligent parishioner and did not have the support of the local vicar, his chances were close to zero. Religion, which was supposed to be a source of comfort, became yet another barrier to salvation.
There is no escaping it.
The amount of assistance was often symbolic. A small pension allowed people to avoid starvation, but did not provide a comfortable life. Recipients of assistance were still forced to live in extreme poverty, saving every penny. But even this small amount was perceived as a great mercy, for which they had to constantly thank their benefactors. It was especially difficult to get help for those who had physical disabilities or chronic illnesses that required care. Charitable societies preferred to help clean old people who could take care of themselves. Bedridden patients and disabled people were too expensive and problematic, so they were referred to workhouses or hospitals for the poor. The entire system was imbued with a spirit of paternalism and moralizing. Wealthy philanthropists flattered their egos by saving selected poor people, but did not seek to change the system that created poverty. Servants remained in a dependent position even after the end of their service. Only now their master was the faceless committee of a charitable society. So charity was a narrow path for the few lucky ones who managed to prove their holiness. For the majority, it remained an unattainable dream, a beautiful signboard behind which closed doors were hidden. In this world of strict rules and a lack of compassion, only the most resilient or the most cunning survived. But there was one category of servants whose fate was particularly unenviable due to the nature of their work. A particular tragedy unfolded in the lives of women who held the highest positions in the hierarchy of servants, housekeepers and cooks. These women often devoted their entire lives to the house, consciously refusing to marry, as their positions required them to live in the mansion and give their all. They were married to their work, and when old age came, they found themselves in a complete vacuum. They had neither husbands nor children who could take care of them. The housekeeper, who had managed the staff for years, held the keys to the pantries and was respected, suddenly became a nobody. Unlike younger maids who could marry and leave the profession, these women sacrificed their chance at personal happiness for the sake of their careers. Their professional pride prevented them from stooping to menial work, and their savings for a comfortable life, as we have already seen, were often insufficient. Cooks suffered from occupational diseases, varicose veins from standing constantly, lung problems from smoke and soot, burns and arthritis. By old age, they were physically unable to do their job, which required lifting heavy pots and working in a hot kitchen. Their culinary skills were not in demand in cheap canteens, and for wealthy households, they were already written off. These women often lived in furnished rooms, renting a corner from strangers. They surrounded themselves with remnants of former luxury, a trinket once given to them as a gift, an old dress, a photograph of their employer's children. These things were their anchors, proof that they once meant something. But these things could not warm them or bring them a glass of water. Psychologically, it was hardest for them to accept their fall from grace. They were used to being in charge, accustomed to a certain standard of living and respect. Finding themselves in the role of beggars was an unbearable humiliation for the former queens of the kitchen. Many of them withdrew into themselves, becoming unsociable recluses, living out their lives in proud solitude. Their stories rarely made it into the newspapers. They died quietly, behind the closed doors of their small rooms. Only occasionally did neighbors notice that an elderly lady in an old-fashioned bonnet had stopped going out to buy bread. This was the price they paid for prestigious work in a wealthy household, a price they paid with their feminine happiness and peaceful old age. An alternative to the workhouse was the almshouse, small shelters often founded by old churches or craft guilds. Getting in was considered incredible, simply fabulous luck, comparable to winning the lottery. Within these walls, the poor found refuge from the horrors of the common night shelter. Unlike the harsh barracks-like regime of workhouses, here the elderly lived in separate small rooms. Sometimes these were even tiny separate houses, standing side by side in a row. This allowed them to preserve a precious semblance of independence and forgotten home comfort. It was the only place where a lonely old man could live out his life in relative peace and quiet. However, the number of places in such blessed refuges was negligible compared to the huge army of people in need. Hundreds of people could claim one vacant place, and the queue stretched for many years. The almshouses themselves were usually built with funds from the wills of wealthy merchants or aristocrats who had died centuries ago. These benefactors tried in this way to atone for their sins and secure a place in paradise for themselves. Their ancient statutes often contain very strange and archaic requirements for applicants. For example, a shelter might only accept widows of sailors from a specific parish. Or the doors were only open to those who were born in a specific county and had worked there all their lives. Sometimes it was necessary to prove one's affiliation with a particular profession or religious community. These strict restrictions immediately ruled out the vast majority of applicants for a peaceful old age. Drunkenness, foul language, or even just an untidy appearance could be a valid reason for immediate expulsion. It was a life under a microscope, where a roof over one's head and a piece of bread had to be paid for with complete obedience. The almshouses themselves were often very old and therefore damp and cold. Behind the beautiful medieval facade of dark stone, there could be constant drafts. Inside, there were often no basic amenities that we are used to today. Sewers and water pipes in such ancient buildings were the last to appear. The elderly had to endure domestic hardships, despite the external splendor of the architecture. The elderly had to heat their rooms themselves, carrying heavy buckets of fuel. Coal or firewood was usually issued by the caretaker in very limited quantities, strictly according to the norm. In winter, there was often not enough heat, and residents had to sleep in their clothes. But even such harsh conditions seemed like paradise compared to life on the streets. Any option was better than ending up in the meat grinder of a workhouse. For former servants from wealthy homes, the almshouse was the last chance to preserve what remained of their status. Here they found themselves among their own kind, in the company of people who were just as impoverished but still respectable. They did not have to mix with vagrants, thieves, and professional beggars. They created their own small, closed communities, fenced off from the outside world by high walls. In the evenings, they drank tea, gossiped, and endlessly reminisced about their past lives in wealthy mansions. These conversations helped them feel like people with a past and dignity. It gave them an important sense of belonging to a certain circle and of security. They were completely deprived of such psychological comfort in the big, cruel world. But even within the quiet walls of the almshouses, death was a frequent visitor. The lack of quality medical care and the advanced age of the residents inevitably took their toll. Doctors rarely visited such institutions, and many could not afford medicine. Funerals here were a common and routine event that surprised few. As soon as a room became vacant, it was immediately occupied by the next lucky person on the long waiting list. The queue only moved forward when someone died. It was a kind of conveyor belt, where the death of one person gave hope for life to another. People waited years for their neighbor to die so they could finally get their own corner. The almshouses were just a drop in the ocean of the endless need of that time. It was a beautiful gesture from the past that could not solve the global problems of the present. The old system of charity was bursting at the seams under the influx of the poor. They remained monuments to a bygone era, unable to cope with the challenges of a new, cruel time. Let us end our story on a rare, almost fairy tale note. Were there those who were truly lucky at the end of their lives? Yes, a few out of thousands received so-called cottages of mercy and favor. These were small, cozy houses located right on the grounds of the manor. The owners gave them to their oldest servants for lifetime and free use. Usually, only those closest to the family were granted such a great honor. Most often, these were nannies who had raised several generations of the master's children. Old gardeners or foresters, who knew every bush in the huge park, could also be lucky. These people devoted their entire lives to serving one family. Life in such a cottage was the unattainable ideal of retirement security in that era. The old man lived in nature, in peace and quiet, close to the place he loved and where he had worked for half a century. He did not have to worry about food or a roof over his head. Food was regularly brought to him from the master's farm, whether it was fresh milk, eggs, or meat. Firewood for the fireplace was delivered directly from the master's forest. Such a pensioner remained an honored part of the estate, rather than being thrown out onto the street like rubbish. The young owners could easily drop in on him during a walk to visit their old nanny. They drank tea, reminisced about their childhood, and showed respect for the gray hair of their faithful servant. It was the very idyllic picture of good old England that was so often painted in classical literature. But why was this phenomenon so rare, almost exceptional? It all came down to harsh pragmatism and banal money saving. Maintaining such a pensioner was quite expensive for the estate. The cottage could be rented out to outsiders at a great profit, or it could be used to house a young and active worker who would bring real benefits to the farm. Land was extremely valuable at that time, and every piece of it had to generate income. Spending valuable resources on a useless old man was considered inefficient management. The aristocracy, gradually losing its position and wealth, began to count every penny. Charity at their own expense became an unaffordable luxury for many landowners. In addition, such generous gifts often depended solely on the personal affection of a particular master. If an old lord who loved his servants suddenly died, the situation could change dramatically. His young heir might have no sentimental feelings for his father's butler or nanny. The new owner often wanted to establish his own order and get rid of unnecessary expenses. He could easily and without remorse evict an old man from his cozy cottage. The housing had to be vacated for his own needs or for new, younger servants. Legally, these cottages never belonged to the residents. They had no property rights. Their position was extremely precarious and depended solely on the goodwill and mood of the current owner. Those who did manage to obtain such a cottage and hold on to it became living legends in the neighborhood. They were viewed with undisguised envy as people who had drawn the luckiest ticket in the lottery of fate. They were talked about in the village and held up as examples to the young. Their prosperity supported the belief in the fairness of the system. Their example diligently supported the very illusion of a good family that we talked about at the very beginning of our story. Looking at the lucky ones, new generations of servants began to hope for the same miracle. They worked harder and more devotedly, dreaming that their old age would be just as peaceful. We have traveled from the front doors of mansions to the gloomy walls of workhouses and the cold streets of London. The story of the old servants of the Victorian era is a story of how human dignity was crushed by the millstones of class inequality and economic expediency. These people, who gave their best years to creating comfort for others, ultimately found themselves superfluous in the world they themselves had helped to build. Their fates show us the true price of the luxury of the past, a price expressed in the loneliness, fear, and hopelessness of thousands of forgotten lives. I hope this story has made you take a fresh look at beautiful costume dramas and think about what remains behind the scenes. If you were interested in learning this hidden truth, write in the comments what topic from the lives of ordinary people of the past you would like to see in the next video. Your ideas help us make better content. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new historical investigations.